Hello, my dear. It's Granny Maria speaking, and my hands were already trembling when the knock came because I knew deep in my bones that this moment would change me forever. I was standing in my small kitchen, the one with the chipped blue tiles and the kettle that screams louder than my old knees when the phone rang. Not a cheerful ring, no, that sharp, impatient sound that slices right through your chest. I wiped my hands on my apron, flour still clinging to my fingers, and answered with the warm voice I always save for family. But what I heard on the other end made the room tilt. My name, spoken carefully, like you'd speak to someone already broken. That tone, oh, I've lived long enough to know it. I sat down hard on the wooden chair. The chair creaked, complaining the way I do in the mornings. They told me there was a meeting. About me. About decisions. I remember staring at the wall where my late husband once marked our heights in pencil, year after year. I remember thinking how strange it is that walls remember more loyalty than people sometimes do. I said I'd come. Of course I did. Granny Maria always comes. I put on my good coat, the brown one with the loose button, and wrapped my scarf twice because the air felt colder than it should have. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, pressing down like a heavy thought you can't shake. Each step toward the bus stop felt like walking back into a memory I wasn't ready to face. On the ride there, I kept telling myself not to assume the worst. "Maria," I whispered, "you've survived harder days than this." But my heart beat too fast, and my mouth tasted like metal. I thought of all the years I'd given. Birthdays remembered, meals cooked, doors kept open even when my pride wanted them shut. I thought of love given freely, without keeping score. When I finally stood in front of that door, the one I'd opened 100 times before, I raised my hand to knock, and paused, because suddenly I wasn't sure I was still welcome on the other side. And that hesitation, that single breath before my knuckles touched the wood, was when everything truly began. I stood there longer than I care to admit, my hand hovering like it had forgotten its purpose. And as I waited, my mind wandered backward the way it always does when fear sneaks in quietly. I kept thinking about how I became this woman standing outside a door that once felt like home. I raised my children with hands that were never idle, scrubbing, sewing, soothing fevers in the night. I missed meals so theirs would be full. I stayed silent when words would have protected me, because peace seemed more important than pride back then. Funny how that kind of silence grows roots and follows you into old age. I remembered my son as a boy, skinny knees, stubborn chin, the way he used to hide behind my skirt when thunder came. I was his shelter once. That thought pressed so hard against my chest, I had to breathe slowly, counting the way my doctor taught me, in and out, in and out. Still, my heart refused to listen. Inside that building, people were talking about me as if I were a problem to be solved. I could feel it. Years teach you to read the air. I knew words like burden and options would be floating around a table polished by other people's confidence. I wondered when I stopped being Maria and became a discussion. My shoes pinched my feet, the same ones I wear only on serious days. I noticed the small things because big emotions make me cling to details. The hum of traffic, the smell of damp wool, the ache in my lower back. I told myself that whatever awaited me, I would face it standing straight. My mother raised me that way. Dignity first, tears later. I knocked, finally. The sound was softer than I intended, almost apologetic. As I waited for footsteps on the other side, I felt the weight of every choice I'd made, every sacrifice stacked neatly behind me like old photo albums no one opens anymore. The door handle began to turn, and in that slow movement, I sensed that what I was about to hear would force me to look at my own life differently. maybe even my own family, and I braced myself for a truth I wasn't sure I could forgive. My son stood there first. Older, of course, grayer at the temples, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. That was the first crack. He stepped aside without touching me, without the Pravichna, "Mama, come in." Inside, the room was too tidy, chairs arranged carefully, like they'd rehearsed this. My daughter-in-law sat stiffly, hands folded, lips pressed into that polite line she uses when she's already decided something. And there, at the far end, a woman I didn't recognize, holding a folder like it weighed more than my whole life. They invited me to sit. Invited. As if I were a guest, not the woman who once slept on a kitchen floor so her children could have beds. I sat anyway, slowly. My knees protested, but my pride stayed quiet. I listened. They spoke in turns, gentle voices wrapped around sharp meanings, words like planning, future, what's best. The stranger finally spoke, explaining she was here to help mediate options. I smiled at her, because that's what I do when I'm nervous. She smiled back like she'd practiced it in a mirror. Then my son cleared his throat. That sound, it carried so much weight, I felt it land on my chest. He said they'd been talking for months, about my living situation, about my independence, about whether it was safe for me to continue as I was. Not once had anyone asked me. I wanted to interrupt, to remind them I still pay my own bills, still cook my own food, still remember every birthday without a calendar. But something in his voice stopped me. Guilt, maybe, or relief. And that frightened me more than anger would have. My daughter-in-law finally said it. They'd found a place. A very nice place, with activities, with care, with rules. She spoke as if she were describing a vacation, not a quiet ending. I felt my fingers curl into my coat, gripping the fabric like it might disappear too. I looked at my son then, really looked, and in his eyes I saw not cruelty, but a decision already made without me. That was when the woman with the folder opened it, slid a paper across the table, and said softly, "We just need your agreement, Maria." And my heart whispered something I wasn't ready to hear yet. I didn't touch it at first. I folded my hands in my lap, the way I used to at church when I was trying not to cry. The room felt tighter, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. I asked one simple question. My voice surprised even me by staying steady. Did I do something wrong? No one answered right away. Silence can be cruel when it's shared by people who know you. My daughter-in-law glanced at my son glanced at the paper, and the woman with the folder cleared her throat again, like she was about to translate my life into bullet points. They spoke faster now, about falls that hadn't happened, about confusion I hadn't shown, about how difficult it was for them to manage worry. That word, worry, was passed to me like a gift I never asked for. I realized then this wasn't about my safety. It was about their comfort. Something inside me shifted. Not anger, not yet. A deep, aching disappointment. I remembered hosting holidays when my hands shook, but I hid it with laughter. I remembered being told, "Sit down, Mama, we've got it." And knowing that meant, step aside. I had stepped aside so often I almost forgot where I belonged. I told them I wasn't ready, that I wanted time. My son sighed, actually sighed, as if I were a stubborn child refusing vegetables. He said they'd already paid a deposit. My stomach dropped. Money had moved before honesty did. The woman slid the pen closer to me. "It's really just a formality," she said gently. Formality. Such a neat word for surrender. I looked at the pen, then at my hands that had held newborns, buried a husband, built a life out of very little. I felt small, yes, but also awake. I stood up, slowly, The chair scraped loudly, startling everyone, including me. My knees screamed, but I ignored them. I said I needed air. My son started to protest, but I raised my hand, not angrily, just firmly. He stopped. That hurt more than if he hadn't. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, breathing in disinfectant and old paint. I realized something terrifying and powerful at the same time. If I didn't speak now, I would disappear politely. Behind the door, I could hear them talking again, lower voices, urgent. And in that moment, I knew the next words out of my mouth would either change everything or cost me more than they understood. I didn't sit down. I stayed standing, one hand on the back of the chair, feeling the worn wood under my fingers like an anchor. They all looked up at me, surprised, a little startled, as if they hadn't expected me to return with my spine intact. The paper was still there, the pen too, waiting. I said their names, slowly, one by one. That alone made the room go quiet. I told them I had listened long enough to plans made about my life without my voice in them. I said I understood fear. I understood worry. What I didn't understand was why love had suddenly started sounding like paperwork. My son opened his mouth, but I kept going. Not loudly. I didn't need to. I told him I remembered the night he had pneumonia at 7, how I sat awake counting his breaths until morning. I reminded him that I had learned fear long before he did, and I never used it to take his choices away. My daughter-in-law's eyes filled with tears, real ones, I think. She said she was just trying to help. I nodded. I told her help doesn't arrive with deposits paid in secret. Help asks first. Then I turned to the woman with the folder. I said this gently because she was only doing her job, but I said it clearly. I was not a case. I was not a problem to be managed. I was still Maria. My hands were shaking now. I didn't hide it. Strength isn't the absence of shaking. It's speaking anyway. I said I would not sign anything today. I said if they wanted to talk, really talk, I was here. But if they wanted obedience, they would not get it from me. My son's face broke then, just for a second. He whispered, I thought this would be easier. And that hurt more than everything else combined. Because I realized this was never meant to be easy for me, only for them. I pushed the paper back across the table. I'm going home, I said. Alone, by choice. No one stopped me this time. As I reached for the door, my heart pounding, I wondered whether I had just saved myself or fractured my family beyond repair. I sat in my kitchen wrapped in my old cardigan, the one with the loose sleeve, listening to the clock tick like it was counting down something important. Every sound felt louder. The refrigerator humming, the pipes knocking, my own breath. I kept replaying my son's face when I walked out, that crack in him. I wondered if I'd imagined it, or if it would harden into something permanent by morning. Just before dawn, my phone rang. Not a message. A call. My stomach tightened the way it used to when the school called unexpectedly. It was him, my son. His voice sounded tired, stripped of the careful tone he'd used the day before. He said he hadn't meant for things to go that far, that they were scared, that people had been whispering in his ear, doctors, neighbors, professionals. I listened without interrupting, my fingers tracing a crack in the table I'd meant to fix years ago. Then he said something that made my chest ache. He said, I thought you'd understand. And I realized how heavy expectations can be when they're placed on the wrong shoulders. I told him understanding doesn't mean surrender. Love doesn't mean erasing yourself quietly to make others comfortable. There was a long pause. I could hear his breathing, uneven. He asked if we could meet again. Just us. No folders, no strangers. My heart wanted to say yes immediately, but my mouth hesitated. I told him I needed to know one thing first, whether he wanted to hear me or just convince me. He didn't answer right away. Later that day, my daughter-in-law came by unannounced. She stood in my doorway, eyes red, holding a bag of groceries like a peace offering. She said she hadn't slept either. She said she was afraid of making the wrong choice and being blamed forever. I invited her in because despite everything, I am still who I am. We talked. Carefully, painfully. Words fell like fragile dishes. Some cracked, some survived. But nothing felt resolved. Underneath every sentence was the same question. How much space is an old woman allowed to take up before she's considered inconvenient? As evening fell, I found the paper they'd left in my coat pocket, the unsigned one. I held it in my hands, feeling its thinness, its quiet threat. I knew the next step I took would decide more than where I lived. And as I folded that paper slowly, I felt the weight of a choice pressing down on me. One that would force everyone, including me, to finally face the truth. I asked my son to come over. Just him. No mediator, no folder, no careful seating arrangement. When he arrived, he stood in the doorway like a boy again, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. I noticed how he looked around my kitchen, really looked, as if seeing it for the first time. The faded curtains, the table with one leg shorter than the others, the smell of soup still clinging to the air. This was the place where he learned to read, where he cried over his first heartbreak. And yet, he'd been ready to erase it with a signature. We sat across from each other. The silence between us felt thicker than any argument. I placed the folded paper on the table, right between us. I told him I wasn't angry. That surprised him. I said anger burns out too fast to be useful. What I felt was something heavier, betrayal mixed with grief. Grief for the moment he stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a problem. He tried to explain again. He said he wakes up at night imagining worst-case scenarios. Me falling, me alone, me forgotten. I reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand I once held to cross busy streets. I told him, fear is not proof. Love requires trust, not control. Then I said the words I'd been holding back. You didn't ask me because you were afraid I'd say no. His eyes filled immediately. He didn't deny it. That was the confirmation I needed, and the wound I wasn't ready for. I told him something else, too. I said that if the day ever comes when I truly can't care for myself, I will ask for help. Pride doesn't blind me that much. But until that day, I will not be quietly relocated to make other people sleep better at night. My life is not a liability. He whispered that his wife felt judged. I said I felt erased. We sat with that. Let it sting. Let it breathe. Then I slid the paper toward him and said calmly, if you bring this into my life again without my consent, you won't be protecting me. You'll be losing me. He looked at the paper, then at me. His hand hovered over it, just like mine had over that door before. And in that suspended moment, I realized everything depended on what he chose to do next. My son's hand trembled above that paper. I could see it now, the same way his hands shook the day he told me he was going to be a father. Fear again. Always fear wearing a different coat. He finally sat back, rubbing his face, and something in him cracked open. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep. He said very quietly that everyone kept telling him what a good son should do, that if something happened to me, they'd all look at him, blame him, judge him. And suddenly I understood. He wasn't trying to save me. He was trying to save himself. That realization hurt in a way I didn't expect. Not sharp, dull, and spreading, like cold in the bones. I told him being a good son doesn't mean making decisions behind your mother's back. It means standing beside her even when the path is uncomfortable, especially then. The air between us felt heavy when there was a knock at the door. I hadn't invited anyone else. My son stiffened. When I opened it, there stood my daughter-in-law, again. Her eyes were red, but her back was straight. She stepped inside and said she didn't want secrets anymore, that she was tired of whispering about me as if I weren't still breathing, still listening, still here. And then she said something that stopped my heart for a second. She admitted the idea hadn't started with concern. It started with impatience, with schedules, with space, with the fear that caring for an aging parent would swallow their lives whole. She said it out loud, finally, and the truth hung there, ugly and honest. I felt tears rise, but I didn't let them fall. I thanked her for saying it, not because it was kind, but because it was real. I told them both that love mixed with resentment turns poisonous if you don't face it early, that I refused to be the silent sacrifice holding their marriage together. My son stood up then. He picked up the paper. For a heartbeat, I thought this was it, that he'd tear it up or sign it himself or walk out. My chest tightened so hard it almost hurt to breathe. He looked at me, eyes shining, and said, "I don't know how to do this right." And I answered him with the hardest truth I know. Neither did I, but I never stopped trying. He lifted the paper higher in his hands. He didn't tear the paper right away. He folded it once, carefully, then again. Each fold felt like a decision being weighed, measured, feared. My daughter-in-law watched him as if holding her breath might influence the outcome. I stayed still. At my age, you learn when movement would only cheapen the moment. "I was wrong," he said. Not loudly, not heroically, just plainly. And those 3 words, oh, they landed harder than any apology ever could. He said he'd let other people's voices grow louder than mine, that he'd confused responsibility with control, that somewhere along the way he'd stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a future problem he needed to manage before it arrived. That's when I felt it break open inside me. I told him how lonely it feels to realize your own child has rehearsed a life without you in it, how painful it is to be discussed, planned around, prepared for, without ever being asked. My voice shook then. I didn't stop it. I said I had already buried one man I loved, and I would not be slowly buried by decisions made for my own good. My daughter-in-law cried openly now. She said she was scared of becoming invisible herself one day. I looked at her and said, gently but firmly, that invisibility doesn't begin with age. It begins when people decide your voice no longer matters. I told her that how they treat me now is how their own children are learning to treat them later. Silence swallowed the room. My son stood up and did something I didn't expect. He knelt. Right there on my kitchen floor, the same floor where he once spilled milk and cried over it. He said he didn't want to lose me, not to a home, not to pride, not to fear. He said he wanted to do this differently, even if it was messy, even if it meant listening to things that made him uncomfortable. I closed my eyes for a moment, because strength can be overwhelming when it finally arrives. I told him I loved him. That love was never the question. But trust. Trust would have to be rebuilt, slowly, honestly, with my consent at the center of it. He nodded. He said he understood. But as I looked at both of them, relieved, shaken, exposed, I knew something crucial was still unresolved. Because saying the right words is only the beginning. And deep down, I wondered whether this moment would truly change how they see me, or if fear would simply find a quieter way back in. The house felt different, not emptier, just honest. I made myself tea and watched the steam rise, remembering how many times I'd rushed to fix things before they cooled too much. This time, I didn't rush. I let everything settle where it wanted to land. love, pain, relief, all sharing the same small room. In the days that followed, things didn't magically heal. Trust never does. My son began calling first, instead of deciding first. Sometimes just to ask how my knees were. Sometimes to ask nothing at all. My daughter-in-law stopped bringing solutions and started bringing herself. We talked without agendas, not perfectly, but truthfully. The paper was never mentioned again. I burned it one morning in the sink, watching it curl and darken until it was nothing but ash. Not out of anger, out of closure. I understood then that dignity doesn't shout. It stays. It waits. It insists quietly on being seen. I also learned something about myself. Courage at my age doesn't look like fighting every battle. It looks like choosing which ones are worth my remaining breath. I keep my door open now, but not unguarded. Boundaries are not walls. They are the shape of self-respect. I know a day may come when I need help, when I'll have to lean harder than I do now, and when that day arrives, I will ask, freely, without shame. But it will be my voice that names the moment, not fear, not convenience, not paperwork. If there is wisdom in all this, my dear, it is this. Growing old does not mean growing smaller. It means standing firmly inside who you are, even when the world tries to move you gently out of the way. I am still Maria, and that is enough.